He had closed billion-dollar deals, shaken hands with kings, and commanded boardrooms. But nothing had ever made Evan Cole's chest ache and his pulse stumble quite like the girl who thought he was just a bartender. The irony wasn't lost on Evan Cole that he had traded a corner office overlooking Manhattan's skyline for a view of Mason's Creek's single traffic light. But as he stood behind the polished mahogany bar of the Rusty Anchor, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. At 31, he commanded an empire worth $12 billion, owned houses on 3 continents, and had his picture on the covers of magazines that declared him one of the world's most eligible bachelors. Yet here he was, in a town so small it didn't even have a Starbucks, helping his childhood friend Jake tend bar while wearing jeans that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The escape had been necessary. 6 months of hostile takeover battles, regulatory investigations, and board meetings that lasted until dawn had left him feeling like a machine programmed for profit, rather than a man capable of genuine human connection. When Jake had called about needing help at his bar while recovering from a broken leg, sustained during what he claimed was a heroic attempt to rescue a cat but was actually a mishap involving too much beer and a poorly executed basketball shot, Evan had seen it as the perfect excuse to disappear from his carefully orchestrated life. Nobody in Mason's Creek knew who he was. To them, he was simply Jake's friend from college who had some time to kill and didn't mind pulling pints and mixing cocktails. The anonymity was intoxicating in ways that champagne and caviar had never been. For the first time in a decade, people looked at him and saw just a man, not a net worth with legs. The Rusty Anchor itself was everything his penthouse wasn't. Warm, unpretentious, filled with mismatched furniture and the kind of comfortable chaos that spoke of real life rather than interior designers. The walls were covered with local memorabilia, fishing trophies, and photographs of townspeople celebrating everything from high school graduations to golden wedding anniversaries. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where stories were currency and laughter came freely. Evan had been there for 2 weeks, settling into a rhythm that felt almost foreign in its simplicity. Wake up at a reasonable hour instead of 4:30 a.m. for conference calls with Tokyo. Eat breakfast without reviewing quarterly reports. Spend his days learning the difference between a proper pour and an amateur one, memorizing drink recipes that had nothing to do with market volatility or merger negotiations. The regulars had accepted him with the easy warmth that characterized small-town life. Old Pete, who claimed to have caught every fish in the county at least twice, regaled him with increasingly improbable tales while nursing beers that lasted 3 hours. Mary Louise, the retired schoolteacher, corrected his technique for everything from glass polishing to customer small talk with the patient authority of someone who had spent 40 years dealing with unruly children. But despite the comfortable routine, despite the peace he had found in this unlikely sanctuary, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something, some sign that this sabbatical from his real life was more than just an extended vacation, that Mason's Creek held something he hadn't known he was looking for. The answer walked through his door on a Thursday evening that had started like any other. And the moment Elena Bennett stepped into the Rusty Anchor, Evan's carefully constructed sense of peace shattered like crystal hitting concrete. She was beautiful, but not in the polished, practiced way of the women who frequented his usual social circles. Her beauty was natural, unguarded. Dark hair that caught the bar's warm lighting, eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations without saying a word, a smile that appeared as she took in the bar's cozy atmosphere with obvious delight. She wore simple clothes that managed to be both casual and elegant, and when she moved toward the bar, there was a grace in her step that made Evan's throat go completely dry. Time seemed to slow as she approached, and Evan found himself cataloging details with an intensity that would have alarmed him if he'd been capable of rational thought. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the soft laugh that escaped when she noticed the bar's collection of vintage beer signs, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when something amused her, suggesting someone who laughed often and genuinely. She settled onto one of the worn leather bar stools and looked up at him with expectant friendliness, clearly assuming he was exactly what he appeared to be, the bartender. For a moment, Evan forgot how to speak, forgot how to breathe, forgot everything except the way her presence seemed to fill the entire space around him with light. When she asked what he'd recommend for someone who didn't usually drink but wanted to try something new, her voice carried the kind of warmth that made even ordinary conversation feel like intimate confession. Evan found himself stammering through suggestions, his usual confidence deserting him completely as he tried to process the fact that this woman, this achingly beautiful, completely unaware woman, was looking at him like he was just a regular guy who happened to work behind a bar. She ordered something simple, a wine spritzer that gave him an excuse to stay close while he prepared it, though his hands shook slightly as he reached for glasses that suddenly felt unfamiliar in his grip. The billionaire who had never met a social situation he couldn't navigate, who had charmed everyone from foreign dignitaries to Fortune 500 CEOs, was reduced to nervous fumbling by a woman who thought he made $8 an hour plus tips. But when she laughed, really laughed, at his clumsy attempt to be casual while opening the wine bottle, something inside Evan's chest cracked open and let in light he hadn't realized he'd been living without. Her laughter was music, was sunlight, was everything genuine and warm and real that his carefully curated life had been missing. He had faced ruthless rivals, but none had undone him the way one small-town smile did. Elena Bennett had come to Mason's Creek with the specific intention of avoiding complications, which made her immediate and intense reaction to the bartender at the Rusty Anchor feel like cosmic irony of the highest order. She was supposed to be taking a break from her mother's increasingly pointed questions about her single status, escaping to visit her college roommate Sarah, who had moved to this impossibly small town for reasons Elena still didn't fully understand. At 28, Elena was tired of being treated like a walking biological clock by her well-meaning but relentless mother, who seemed to view every family gathering as an opportunity to discuss Elena's reproductive timeline with the strategic intensity of a military campaign. The visit to Mason's Creek was meant to be a refuge, a place where she could simply exist without defending her life choices or explaining why she hadn't settled down with any of the perfectly adequate men her mother kept introducing her to. But the moment she walked into the Rusty Anchor and saw the man behind the bar, Elena's carefully constructed plan to avoid romantic complications went up in flames. He was devastating in a way that seemed almost unfair, tall and lean with the eye, kind of easy masculine grace that suggested he moved through the world with confidence earned rather than assumed. His dark hair was slightly mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it, and when he looked up at her approach, his eyes held an intensity that made her pulse stutter in ways that had nothing to do with the wine she hadn't even ordered yet. But more than his obvious physical appeal, there was something about the way he looked at her that made Elena feel like she was the only person in the room, possibly the only person in the world. His attention was complete, focused, as if her simple request for a drink recommendation was the most important conversation he'd had all day. She found herself studying his face as he worked, noting details that seemed far too intimate for a first meeting. The way he concentrated when mixing her drink, the slight furrow between his brows that suggested he was taking her order more seriously than strictly necessary, the way his hands moved with surprising elegance, despite what appeared to be nervousness about the task. There was something almost endearing about his obvious inexperience behind the bar. He fumbled with the wine opener in a way that suggested this wasn't his usual occupation. And when he dropped the cork twice while trying to pour her spritzer, Elena found herself laughing not at him but with genuine amusement at the situation. What struck her most was how he responded to her laughter. Instead of embarrassment or irritation, his face lit up as if she'd just given him the most precious gift imaginable. The smile that transformed his features was so warm, so genuinely delighted, that Elena felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with amusement and everything to do with the way his eyes crinkled when he was happy. Their conversation flowed with the kind of easy naturalness that Elena had been searching for in countless dates, with men who looked perfect on paper, but felt like strangers even after months of acquaintance. This bartender, she hadn't even learned his name yet, made her laugh with observations about small-town life that were both affectionate and gently satirical, asked questions about her own life that seemed motivated by genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. When he admitted that he was new to bartending and was still learning the difference between shaken and stirred, Elena found his honesty refreshing in a world where everyone seemed determined to present themselves as experts at everything. There was something almost vulnerable about the way he confessed his inexperience, as if her opinion of his cocktail-making abilities actually mattered to him. But what really undid her was the way he listened when she talked. Not with the distracted attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with the focused intensity of someone who found her thoughts genuinely fascinating. When she mentioned her reasons for visiting Mason's Creek, her need for a break from family pressure about her single status, his expression grew protective in a way that made her stomach flip with unexpected warmth. He seemed to understand, without her having to explain, the peculiar exhaustion that came from being constantly evaluated as potential wife material, rather than simply appreciated as a person. His responses to her stories carried just the right mix of sympathy and humor, making her feel heard without being pitied, understood without being patronized. The evening passed with shocking speed, their conversation ranging from serious topics to silly observations about small-town characters, and Elena found herself completely charmed by this man who seemed to combine intelligence with genuine kindness, sophistication with approachable warmth. When she finally realized how late it had gotten and reluctantly prepared to leave, the bartender's obvious disappointment at her departure made her heart do things that she absolutely was not prepared to analyze. The way he watched her gather, her purse, the slight hesitation before he wished her a good evening, the hope in his voice when he mentioned that the bar was open most nights. It all suggested that their conversation had affected him as much as it had affected her. Walking back to Sarah's house through Mason's Creek's quiet streets, Elena found herself replaying every moment of their interaction with the kind of detailed mental review she usually reserved for job interviews or important presentations. Something about the evening felt significant in ways she couldn't quite articulate, as if she'd stumbled across something precious while looking for something else entirely. For the first time in months, her mother's pressure about settling down felt less oppressive, not because she had found someone to present as a potential husband, but because she had remembered what it felt like to connect with someone genuinely, to laugh without calculating the impression she was making, to simply enjoy another person's company without agenda or expectation. It wasn't her beauty that left him undone. It was the way she made him forget he was a billionaire at all. Evan spent the entire night after Elena's first visit replaying every moment of their conversation, with the obsessive attention he usually reserved for merger documents that could make or break quarterly earnings. By morning, he had analyzed every laugh, every pause, every fleeting expression that had crossed her face, and reached the terrifying conclusion that he was in serious trouble. The woman who thought he was a bartender had managed to accomplish something that years of therapy, meditation, and expensive vacations had failed to achieve. She had made him forget, completely and utterly, that he was Evan Cole, billionaire CEO. For 3 hours, he had simply been a man talking to a woman who made him want to be clever and charming and worthy of her attention. When she returned the following evening, Evan's heart performed acrobatics that would have impressed Olympic gymnasts. She approached the bar with the same warm smile that had kept him awake the night before, settling onto what he had already begun thinking of as her stool with casual familiarity that suggested she planned to make this a regular occurrence. The prospect of seeing her regularly should have terrified him, considering the massive deception he was perpetrating, but instead it filled him with anticipation so intense it was almost painful. Every day that she might walk through that door became a gift he didn't deserve, but was desperate to receive. Their second conversation picked up where the first had ended, with the easy comfort of old friends rather than virtual strangers. Elena seemed determined to help him improve his bartending skills, offering gentle corrections and helpful suggestions with the patient kindness of someone genuinely invested in his success. The irony that a woman was teaching him to make drinks when he owned enough wine collections to stock several restaurants was not lost on him. But her enthusiasm was so infectious that he found himself genuinely trying to master techniques he would never need in his real life when she laughed at his attempt to flip a cocktail shaker, an ambitious move that ended with ice cubes scattered across the floor and both of them dissolving into giggles. Evan experienced a moment of pure joy so intense it was almost spiritual. Her laughter was like discovering music for the first time, like seeing color after a lifetime of grayscale, like every cliché about love that he had previously dismissed as romantic nonsense. But it wasn't just her laughter that undid him, though that was certainly devastating enough. It was the way she made him feel human in ways he hadn't experienced since building his empire had consumed every aspect of his identity. With Elena, he wasn't the man whose decisions affected thousands of employees and millions in revenue. He wasn't the person who appeared on magazine covers or gave interviews about market trends. He was just someone she enjoyed talking to, someone who could make her smile, someone worth her time and attention for no reason other than his own merit. The topics of their conversations ranged from profound to ridiculous, often within the same breath. One moment they would be discussing the philosophical implications of small-town life versus urban ambition, and the next they would be debating the relative merits of different beer brands with the passionate intensity of people who had strong opinions about truly unimportant things. Elena possessed the kind of quick wit that kept him on his intellectual toes, challenging his observations and offering counterpoints that forced him to think in ways that had nothing to do with profit margins or market analysis. She was educated without being pretentious, thoughtful without being heavy, funny without being cruel. Everything he had convinced himself didn't exist in one person. But perhaps most dangerous was the way she seemed genuinely interested in him as a person. She asked questions about his life, his thoughts, his experiences, with the kind of focused attention that suggested she actually cared about the answers. When he told her carefully edited stories about his past, his friendship with Jake, his college experiences, his reasons for being in Mason's Creek, she listened with engagement that made him wish desperately that he could tell her everything. The deception was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, not because he was in danger of slipping up with factual details, but because lying to her felt like betraying something precious. Every moment of their developing connection was built on a fundamental dishonesty that made him feel simultaneously guilty and terrified. Guilty because she deserved the truth, and terrified because the truth might destroy the most meaningful relationship he had ever experienced. Their third evening together established a pattern that Evan began to crave with dangerous intensity. Elena would arrive around 7, order something simple that gave them an excuse to talk while he prepared it with elaborate care, and then they would spend hours in conversation that felt both casual and intimate. Other customers came and went, but somehow their corner of the bar became its own private world where nothing existed except their voices and the growing awareness that something significant was developing between them. The bar physical awareness was there too, though carefully unspoken. The way her fingers brushed his when he handed her drinks, the electricity that seemed to crackle in the space between them when she leaned across the bar to make a point. The way his entire nervous system went on high alert whenever she laughed, whenever she smiled, whenever she looked at him with those eyes that seemed to see straight through to parts of himself he had forgotten existed. Evan found himself living for those moments when their hands would accidentally touch, when she would lean close enough that he could catch the subtle scent of her perfume, when she would look at him with an expression that suggested she was as affected by their connection as he was. The billionaire who had commanded attention in international board meetings was reduced to hoping for the brush of a woman's fingers against his own. He had built an empire, but with her laughter he felt richer than ever. By the end of Elena's first week of regular visits to the Rusty Anchor, Evan had developed what could only be described as an addiction. Not to alcohol. The irony of a billionaire bartender developing a drinking problem was too obvious even for his increasingly chaotic emotional state. But to the sound of her voice, the warmth of her laughter, and the devastating sweetness of her smile directed at him as if he were the most fascinating person she had ever encountered. Their conversations had evolved beyond casual bar chat into something that felt dangerously intimate, though they had never discussed anything more personal than career aspirations and childhood memories. Elena had a way of drawing out parts of his personality that Evan had forgotten existed, encouraging him to be funny and spontaneous, in ways that had nothing to do with calculated charm or strategic social maneuvering. She made him want to be a better version of himself, not the improved quarterly earnings version that his board of directors preferred, but the kind of man who deserved the trust and affection of someone as genuinely good as she was proving to be. The problem was that becoming worthy of Elena seemed to require being honest with Elena, and honesty would destroy the foundation of their entire relationship. The torture was exquisite and constant. Every evening brought fresh revelations about her character, her dreams, her way of seeing the world, and every revelation made Evan more certain that he was falling in love with her and more terrified that she was falling for someone who didn't technically exist. When she talked about her mother's pressure to settle down, Elena's tone carried a mixture of frustration and resigned affection that made Evan want to protect her from every person who had ever made her feel inadequate for being single. She described family gatherings where she was treated like a project to be completed rather than a person to be celebrated. Dinner parties where she was introduced to suitable men with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for dental procedures. The picture she painted of her romantic history was both heartbreaking and hopeful. She had dated men who looked perfect on paper but felt like strangers in person, who checked all the appropriate boxes for stability and respectability, but failed to make her laugh, to make her feel seen, to make her excited about the possibility of building a life together. What she wanted, she told him with the kind of vulnerable honesty that made his chest ache, was something simple and real. A partner who would choose her every day, not because she was the logical choice, but because she was the only choice. Someone who would make her laugh over morning coffee and hold her hand during movies and remember the little details that made her feel cherished. Every word of her romantic manifesto felt like a knife through Evan's heart because it described exactly the kind of relationship he wanted to build with her, the kind of man he wanted to be for her. But it also emphasized the gap between who she thought he was and who he actually was. She spoke dreamily about the appeal of an ordinary life with extraordinary love, about finding someone whose ambitions were personal rather than global, someone who would prioritize their relationship over career advancement or social climbing. She wanted someone who would be present for the small moments, grocery, shopping and lazy Sunday mornings, and conversations that lasted until 3 a.m. simply. Because neither person wanted them to end, Evan hung on, every word while simultaneously wanting to disappear through the floorboards. She was describing the antithesis of his actual existence, painting a picture of contentment that was completely incompatible with the reality of running a $12 billion empire that demanded constant attention and frequent travel to places where the time zones made normal relationship maintenance nearly impossible. But even worse than the incompatibility of their lifestyles was the growing certainty that Elena was beginning to care about him, not Evan Cole, the billionaire, but the fictional bartender version of himself who had no responsibilities beyond mixing drinks and making her smile. Every evening brought increased warmth in her greetings, more personal questions about his thoughts and feelings, longer lingering looks when she thought he wasn't paying attention. The physical tension between them was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore or explain away as friendly appreciation. Elena had begun touching his arm when she laughed at his jokes, reaching across the bar to brush his hand with her fingers when making a point, leaning close enough during their conversations that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. Her body language suggested someone who was attracted and interested and increasingly comfortable expressing that interest in subtle ways. The problem was that every gesture of growing intimacy felt simultaneously like the most wonderful and most terrible thing that had ever happened to him. Wonderful because Elena Bennett was falling for him, actually falling for him, not his net worth or his social status or his ability to provide access to exclusive experiences, but for his humor and his attention and his company. After years of wondering whether anyone would ever see past his wealth to care about him as a person, he had found someone who was doing exactly that. Terrible because she was falling for someone who didn't exist, someone whose entire identity was built on deception, someone whose real life would probably horrify her given everything she had said about wanting simplicity and authenticity and ordinariness, the internal war between his desire to tell her the truth and his terror of losing her was consuming him in ways that made normal functioning nearly impossible. Evan found himself lying awake at night, constructing elaborate scenarios where he could reveal his identity gradually, gently, in ways that would allow her to adjust to the reality of who he was without feeling completely betrayed. But every imaginary conversation ended the same way, with Elena looking at him with hurt and disappointment, with her trust shattered and their connection destroyed by the fundamental dishonesty that had made their relationship possible in the first place. Pretending to be ordinary was easy. Pretending not to love her was impossible. The first sign of trouble walked into the Rusty Anchor on a Tuesday evening when Elena was describing her disastrous attempt to cook dinner for Sarah, complete with smoke alarm sound effects and dramatic reenactment of her panic when she realized she had confused salt with sugar in what was supposed to be a simple pasta dish. Evan was laughing so hard he could barely breathe, completely enchanted by her ability to find humor in domestic catastrophe, when the door chimed and a man entered who made every protective instinct Evan possessed flare to life with volcanic intensity. The newcomer was exactly the kind of person Elena had described wanting. Clean-cut, obviously local, with the kind of steady, dependable appearance that screamed appropriate marriage material to mothers everywhere. He moved through the bar with the easy confidence of someone who belonged, greeting other patrons by name and carrying himself with the comfortable assurance of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. But what made Evan's jaw clench with Primitive? Jealousy was the way the man's eyes fixed on Elena the moment he spotted her, his entire demeanor shifting into what could only be described as hunting mode. The smile that crossed his face was predatory in the way that men smiled when they saw something they wanted and believed they could obtain through persistence and conventional charm. Elena seemed oblivious to the attention, still giggling over her culinary disaster story, but Evan was hyper-aware of every step the stranger took in their direction, every calculating glance he cast toward Elena's profile, every detail of his appearance that suggested he was preparing to insert himself into their conversation. The introduction, when it came, was everything Evan had been dreading. The man was Michael Thompson, a local real estate agent who had apparently heard about the beautiful visitor from several mutual acquaintances and had decided to investigate for himself. He was polite, charming in a conventional way, and utterly transparent in his interest in Elena, and she seemed genuinely pleased to meet him. Watching Elena engage with Michael felt like receiving physical torture designed specifically to exploit Evan's deepest insecurities. Michael was everything she had said she wanted: local, stable, uncomplicated by global responsibilities or international business concerns. He owned a small real estate firm, coached Little League baseball, volunteered at the local animal shelter, and had roots in Mason's Creek that went back 3 generations. When Michael casually mentioned that he would love to show Elena around town, pointing out local attractions and historical sites that might interest someone visiting from the big city, Evan felt something crack inside his chest that might have been his heart breaking. Elena's enthusiastic acceptance of the invitation was delivered with the kind of warm gratitude that made it clear she found Michael's attention flattering and his company appealing. The worst part was that Michael was genuinely nice. He wasn't sleazy or pushy or obviously inappropriate in ways that would have given Evan clear grounds for disapproval. He was exactly the kind of man that Elena's mother would have approved of, exactly the kind of stable, ordinary, locally rooted person that Elena had described as her ideal romantic. Partner Evan was forced to maintain his bartender facade while watching Michael work his wholesome charm on the woman he was, falling deeper in love with every day. Every shared laugh between Elena and Michael felt like a knife between his ribs. Every moment of animated conversation about local events and mutual acquaintances was a reminder that Michael could offer Elena the authentic small-town life she craved, while Evan could only offer elaborate deception and eventual heartbreak. When Michael mentioned his family's annual barbecue and suggested Elena might enjoy meeting some of the other young professionals in town, Evan gripped the glass he was cleaning so tightly he was surprised it didn't shatter. The casual way Michael was already incorporating Elena into his social circle, introducing her to his community as if she belonged there, was exactly the kind of organic courtship that led to engagement rings and wedding, invitations, and all the ordinary happiness Elena had said she wanted. But perhaps most devastating was the way Elena responded to Michael's attention. She didn't seem smitten exactly, but she was clearly pleased by his interest, flattered by his pursuit, and intrigued by the possibility of exploring a connection with someone who represented everything she had said she was looking for in a partner. Evan was forced to witness their growing acquaintance from behind the bar, mixing drinks and making conversation while internally fighting the urge to reveal his true identity, just to prove that he could compete with Michael on any level that mattered. The billionaire who had never lost a business competition was discovering what it felt like to be utterly helpless in the face of romantic rivalry. The evening ended with Michael walking Elena to her car, their conversation continuing on the sidewalk outside the Rusty Anchor, where Evan could see them through the window but couldn't hear what they were discussing. The body language was encouraging, at least from Michael's perspective. Elena was smiling, laughing, accepting what appeared to be Michael's business card with expressions of genuine interest. When she returned to say goodbye to Evan before leaving, her casual mention that Michael seemed really nice and that she was looking forward to his tour of the town hit Evan like a physical blow. She was already thinking of Michael in terms of future plans, already anticipating spending time with him, already viewing him as someone worth getting to know better. That night, Evan lay awake staring at the ceiling of Jake's guest room and contemplating the possibility that he had found the love of his life only to lose her to someone who could offer her everything he couldn't: honesty, simplicity, and a life uncomplicated by the demands of global commerce and public scrutiny. For the first time since taking over his father's company, Evan Cole wished desperately that he was exactly who Elena thought he was, just a bartender with no responsibilities beyond making drinks and no complications beyond deciding what time to close up shop. This time, Evan wasn't fighting for business. He was fighting for his very heart. The morning after Michael Thompson had waltzed into the Rusty Anchor and casually threatened everything Evan cared about, the billionaire in hiding made a decision that would have shocked every business associate who had ever described him as calculating and controlled. He was going to fight for Elena, and he was going to fight dirty, or at least as dirty as someone pretending to be a small-town bartender could manage without blowing his cover entirely. The plan began with research that had nothing to do with market analysis and everything to do with understanding exactly what he was up against. Evan spent the morning making subtle inquiries about Michael Thompson, gathering intelligence that painted a picture of someone frustratingly perfect for Elena's stated preferences. Michael was well-liked, financially stable without being wealthy, actively involved in community activities, and possessed the kind of steady reliability that mothers everywhere endorsed in potential sons-in-law. But Evan had advantages that Michael couldn't possibly match, even if he couldn't reveal most of them. He had Elena's attention every evening, an established rapport that had been building for weeks, and the kind of intense focus that came from having his entire emotional well-being dependent on the outcome of this particular romantic campaign. When Elena arrived that evening, Evan was ready to deploy every weapon in his considerable arsenal of charm, carefully adapted for his bartender persona but no less devastating for the disguise. The moment she settled onto her usual stool, he launched into the kind of focused attention that had made him legendary in business negotiations. Except this time, instead of securing merger agreements, he was fighting for the right to make the woman he loved fall in love with him. The flirtation began subtly, with compliments that were more specific and personal than his previous casual friendliness. Instead of generic observations about her appearance, Evan found himself noting details that revealed just how closely he had been paying attention. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about her students, the graceful gesture she made when pushing hair behind her ear, the particular laugh she reserved for stories she found genuinely amusing, rather than merely polite. Elena responded to the increased attention with visible surprise, followed by obvious pleasure. Her cheeks flushed pink when he told her that her smile was the best part of his day, and she seemed genuinely flustered when he mentioned that he had been thinking about their conversation from the previous evening and had come up with several counter-arguments to points she had made about small-town social dynamics. But Evan's secret weapon wasn't compliments or attention. It was the way he listened to her with the complete focus of someone whose success depended on understanding every nuance of communication. When Elena talked, Evan didn't just hear her words. He absorbed her tone, her pauses, her body language, her emotional subtext. He responded not just to what she said, but to what she meant, what she felt, what she needed to hear in response. The physical flirtation was more challenging to navigate given the constraints of his bartender role and Elena's obvious comfort with their established dynamic, but Evan found ways to increase the electricity between them without crossing lines that might alarm her. He let his fingers linger when handing her drinks, created opportunities for their hands to brush when reaching for the same napkin or menu, positioned himself at angles that required her to look up at him in ways that made their height difference feel intimate, rather than merely practical. When she laughed at his increasingly elaborate attempts to master cocktail preparation, He was genuinely trying to improve his bartending skills, partly for cover, and partly because her encouragement made him want to excel at everything. Evan felt the same rush of accomplishment he experienced when closing major business deals, except magnified by the personal stakes involved. But perhaps most effective was the way he began incorporating her into his work routine. Asking for her opinion on drink combinations, requesting her help with tasks that required her to move around the bar and work beside him. The manufactured intimacy of shared activity, combined with the casual physical proximity of working in the same small space, created moments of awareness that left them both slightly breathless and obviously affected. Elena seemed to recognize that something had shifted in their dynamic. Though she appeared more intrigued than alarmed by the change, she began returning his flirtation with subtle signals of her own: longer eye contact during conversation, more frequent laughter at his jokes, increased physical touch that seemed casual but felt deliberately intimate. The real test came when Michael Thompson appeared again, arriving with flowers and an invitation to dinner that made Evan's hands clench into fists behind the bar. But instead of passively watching Elena respond to another man's courtship, Evan inserted himself into the conversation with the kind of smooth confidence that had made him successful in every competitive situation he had ever encountered. He complimented Michael's choice of flowers while simultaneously pointing out Elena's preference for wildflowers over formal arrangements, a detail he had gleaned from previous conversations and deployed with surgical precision. He engaged Michael in friendly conversation that subtly highlighted their different backgrounds and perspectives, establishing himself as someone who understood Elena's preferences and personality in ways that newcomers couldn't match. When Michael suggested dinner at the town's fanciest restaurant, Evan casually mentioned the picnic Elena had described wanting to have by the lake, complete with homemade food and sunset watching. The comparison between formal dining and intimate outdoor experiences was clearly not lost on Elena, who seemed to be re-evaluating both. Invitations with new consideration for which option better matched her actual interests, but Evan's masterstroke came when he offered to prepare a special cocktail he had been developing, specifically for Elena, a drink that incorporated flavors she had mentioned enjoying, created with techniques he had been practicing in preparation for this moment, presented with the kind of thoughtful attention that demonstrated weeks of careful observation and genuine caring. The drink was perfect, and Elena's reaction to both the cocktail and the gesture behind it was everything Evan had hoped for. Her surprise and delight at his thoughtfulness, her obvious pleasure at being so specifically considered and catered to, her warm gratitude for the effort he had invested in creating something just for her. It all contrasted sharply with Michael's more generic romantic offerings. If she ever chose the other man, Evan knew it would break him in ways no financial loss ever could. The problem with maintaining an elaborate deception, while simultaneously conducting the most important courtship of his life, was that Evan's natural instincts kept conflicting with his carefully constructed bartender persona. 3 weeks of competing with Michael Thompson for Elena's attention had left cracks in his disguise that were becoming increasingly difficult to explain away as coincidence or lucky guessing. It started with small things that Elena was too polite to question directly but clearly noticed. When she mentioned being interested in a particular author, Evan not only knew the writer's work, but could discuss the subtle themes and literary influences with the kind of detailed knowledge that suggested expensive graduate education rather than casual reading. When she talked about wanting to visit certain destinations, he offered insights about hotels and restaurants, and cultural attractions that sounded suspiciously like first-hand experience rather than travel guide research. But the real problems began when Evan's protective instincts and competitive nature started overriding his common sense. The evening Elena mentioned that her car had been making strange noises, Evan's immediate response was to offer the services of the best mechanic in the Mo region, a man who happened to service his own collection of luxury vehicles and charged rates that would have seemed astronomical to someone living on bartender wages. When Elena looked surprised by his knowledge of high-end automotive repair, Evan hastily covered by claiming he had heard good things about the mechanic, but the explanation felt thin even to his own ears. A bartender in a small town shouldn't have been casually familiar with specialists who catered to wealthy collectors, and Elena's thoughtful expression suggested she was beginning to notice the inconsistencies. The wine incident was worse. Elena had been describing a bottle she'd enjoyed at a dinner party, mentioning the vineyard, but unable to remember the specific vintage. Without thinking, Evan identified not only the year, but the particular characteristics that made that vintage special, the optimal serving temperature, and the food pairings that would complement its flavor profile best. The kind of detailed wine knowledge that suggested either professional sommelier training or the sort of expensive hobby that required serious financial resources. Elena stared at him with obvious curiosity, clearly wondering how a small-town bartender had acquired such sophisticated expertise. Evan's explanation that he was interested in wines sounded increasingly inadequate when combined with his ability to discuss grape varietals and fermentation techniques with the fluency of someone who had spent years collecting bottles that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But the most dangerous crack appeared when Michael Thompson made the mistake of condescending to Elena during one of his visits, explaining local politics with the kind of patronizing tone that suggested he thought visiting city women needed small-town men to interpret the world for them. Evan watched Elena's jaw tighten with irritation, saw the flash of anger in her eyes at being spoken to like a child, and felt his own temper flare with protective fury. The response that emerged from his mouth was delivered in the kind of commanding tone that had silenced boardrooms and made Fortune 500 executives reconsider their positions. He corrected Michael's oversimplified explanation with the sort of nuanced political analysis that suggested extensive experience with policymaking and economic development, speaking with an authority that belonged to someone who had personally dealt with governors and congresspeople, rather than someone who mixed drinks for a living. The silence that followed his impromptu lecture was deafening. Michael looked stunned by the bartender's unexpected expertise, while Elena studied Evan's face with the kind of intense scrutiny that made him realize he had just revealed far more about his background than any reasonable cover story could explain. When Elena asked quietly where he had learned so much about economic policy, Evan found himself improvising desperately about college courses and personal reading, but he could see in her expression that she was no longer entirely convinced by his explanations. The woman who had fallen for a simple bartender was beginning to suspect that the man behind the bar was considerably more complicated than he appeared. The physical evidence was becoming problematic, too. Despite his efforts to dress down for his role, Evan couldn't entirely hide the markers of his actual lifestyle. His haircut was too expensive, maintained by a stylist who charged more per session than most people spent on clothing. His casual clothes, while deliberately chosen to appear ordinary, were cut from fabrics and constructed with attention to detail that spoke of price points far beyond normal retail. But most telling were his hands, soft in ways that suggested he had never done real manual labor, manicured with the kind of careful attention that belonged to someone who shook hands with international dignitaries and appeared in business magazines. When Elena commented on how well-maintained his hands were for someone in food service, Evan realized that even his attempts at disguise were betraying him. The technology slips were perhaps most dangerous, because they were hardest to control. When Elena's phone died during one of their conversations, Evan automatically pulled out his own device to continue looking up something they had been discussing, and Elena's eyes widened at the sight of the latest, most expensive smartphone model, the kind that required either serious tech enthusiasm or serious disposable income. Her casual question about how he could afford such an expensive phone on bartender wages caught him completely off guard, and his mumbled explanation about saving up and getting a good deal sounded unconvincing even to himself. Elena didn't challenge his answer directly, but her expression suggested she was filing away another piece of evidence that didn't fit the picture he had been painting. The breaking point came when Elena mentioned struggling with a computer problem that was affecting her work, and Evan's instinctive response was to offer help that revealed far more technological expertise than any reasonable bartender should have possessed. His casual familiarity with advanced software, his ability to diagnose complex technical issues from her description, his offer to call someone who could fix it remotely, a loss of it pointed toward resources and connections that contradicted his supposed simple life. But perhaps most dangerous was the way Elena had begun studying him during their conversations, her attention shifting from casual enjoyment of his company to active analysis of the inconsistencies in his presentation. She was clearly intelligent enough to recognize that the pieces didn't fit together, observant enough to notice the growing list of things that didn't make sense about his background and abilities. the woman who had been falling for a bartender was beginning to realize that the bartender might not actually exist, and Evan could see in her eyes the growing awareness that she had been systematically deceived by someone whose real identity remained a complete mystery. The truth was pressing at the walls of his secret, threatening to burst free at any moment. The truth exploded into the open on a Friday evening that had started like any other, with Elena settling onto her usual bar stool and Evan preparing her favorite drink, while they fell into the easy conversation that had become the highlight of both their days. But tonight there was something different in Elena's demeanor. A tension beneath her usual warmth. A watchfulness that suggested she had spent considerable time thinking about the inconsistencies that had been accumulating around his carefully constructed identity. The catalyst was absurdly simple. Elena's phone rang during their conversation, displaying her mother's contact information with a photo that made Evan smile despite the growing tension in the air. Without thinking, he commented that Elena had her mother's eyes, a casual observation that froze Elena mid-reach for her device. She stared at him with dawning comprehension, her voice carefully neutral as she asked how he could possibly know what her mother looked like. The question hung between them like a sword waiting to fall, and Evan realized with crystalline clarity that his weeks of deception had just collapsed under the weight of one careless, affectionate comment. The photo on her phone screen showed a woman at what was clearly an upscale charity gala, the kind of high society fundraiser that appeared regularly in business magazines and social pages. Elena's mother was photographed accepting an award for her philanthropic work, surrounded by the kind of people who moved in circles that small-town bartenders never encountered. But Evan had encountered them. More than encountered, he had shared tables with many of the people visible in the background of Elena's mother's award photo. He had attended dozens of similar events, had probably even met Elena's mother at some point during the endless rotation of charity galas that filled his social calendar. The recognition in Elena's eyes was immediate and devastating as she processed not just his familiarity with her mother's appearance, but the implications of how he might have acquired that knowledge. She looked from his face to her phone screen and back again, and Evan watched her mentally catalog every suspicious moment, every inconsistency, every detail that should have warned her that he was not what he appeared to be. The confrontation, when it came, was delivered in the kind of controlled voice that Elena probably used with particularly difficult students, calm on the agony surface but carrying an undercurrent of hurt and anger that cut Evan deeper than any shouting would have. She asked directly who he was, what game he was playing, and why he had been lying to her for weeks. The questions were fair, reasonable, and completely impossible to answer without destroying everything they had built together. But the destruction was already underway, had probably been inevitable from the moment he chose deception over honesty, and Evan found himself faced with the choice he had been dreading since their first conversation. The revelation came in stages, like peeling back layers of carefully applied bandages to reveal a wound that had been festering underneath. First, his real name, Evan Cole, not the Evan who just happened to be helping out his friend Jake. Then his actual profession, delivered in a voice that sounded hollow even to his own ears as he admitted to being the CEO of a company whose name Elena recognized from financial news and business headlines. But the detail that seemed to hit Elena hardest was the scope of his wealth. The realization that the man she had been teaching to make cocktails commanded a personal fortune that placed him among the richest people in the country. The bartender who had fumbled with wine openers and laughed at his own mistakes was actually someone who owned multiple homes, traveled by private jet, and appeared regularly on lists of America's most eligible bachelors. Elena's reaction was everything Evan had feared and worse. The hurt in her eyes was devastating, but it was the disappointment that nearly destroyed him. The realization that he had not just deceived her about his identity, but had systematically manipulated her emotions while hiding behind a lie that made their entire relationship feel suspect. She asked the questions he had been dreading. How much of their connection had been real? Had he been laughing at her naivety while she worried about his bartending skills and offered to help him improve? Had her simple small-town visitor routine been amusing entertainment for a billionaire slumming it in rural America? But worse than her questions were her conclusions about his motivations. Elena assumed that his deception had been motivated by boredom, by the wealthy man's desire for an amusing diversion from his real life, by curiosity about how ordinary people lived and loved when they Didn't know they were being observed by someone who could buy and sell their entire world without affecting his bank balance. The defense Evan offered, that he had been desperate to be loved for himself rather than his money, that her attraction to the bartender had given him hope that someone could care about him as a person rather than a net worth, sounded pathetic even to his own ears when weighed against the magnitude of his deception. Elena listened to his explanation with the kind of careful attention she had always given his words, but now her focus felt clinical rather than intimate, as if she were analyzing a specimen rather than processing the desperate honesty of someone whose heart was breaking in real time. When he finished speaking, the silence stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Elena sat perfectly still, staring at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time, and Evan realized that the woman who had fallen in love with a bartender was looking at a stranger who happened to wear the same face. But then something shifted in her expression, some internal calculation that he couldn't read, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, still hurt, still angry, but also thoughtful in ways that gave him the first glimmer of hope he had felt since the conversation began. She told him that she needed time to think, to process not just his real identity, but everything they had shared, to figure out what had been genuine and what had been performance. But as she gathered her things to leave, Elena paused and looked back at him with an expression that was impossible to interpret. The question she asked as she reached the door cut straight to the heart of everything that mattered. Had he been pretending to care about her, or had the caring been the only real thing in all his lies? She didn't need the empire, but she couldn't deny the man who had laid his heart bare before her. The 3 days that followed Elena's discovery of his true identity were the longest of Evan's life, each hour crawling by with the agonizing slowness of someone waiting for a verdict that would determine his entire future. He remained at the Rusty Anchor, helping Jake and hoping desperately that Elena would return, that she would give him a chance to explain not just who he was, but why he had fallen so completely in love with her that the thought of losing her made breathing feel impossible. When she finally walked through the door on Monday evening, Evan's heart performed acrobatics that would have been impressive if they hadn't felt like they might actually kill him. Elena looked tired but determined, carrying herself with the kind of careful composure that suggested she had spent the intervening days in serious contemplation about decisions that would affect both their futures. She didn't take her usual seat at the bar. Instead, she chose a corner table that offered privacy for the conversation they both knew was coming, and Evan approached with the kind of nervous anticipation he hadn't felt since his first major business presentation 20 years earlier. The conversation that followed was unlike anything in Evan's experience, more honest than any business negotiation, more vulnerable than any therapy session, more important than any decision he had ever made about mergers or acquisitions or corporate strategy. Elena asked him to explain everything, not just the facts of his deception, but the feelings behind it, the motivations that had led him to choose lies over honesty and performance over authenticity. Evan found himself telling her things he had never admitted to anyone, including the therapists and business coaches who had tried for years to help him understand why personal relationships felt so much more challenging than professional ones. He talked about the loneliness of being valued primarily for wealth rather than character, about the exhaustion of never knowing whether people liked him or liked his ability to provide access to exclusive experiences and expensive gifts. But most importantly, he told her about the moment she had walked into the Rusty Anchor and made him forget everything except the desire to be worthy of her attention, worthy of her laughter, worthy of the genuine warmth she offered so freely to someone she thought was just an ordinary man trying to make her evening a little brighter. He explained how her simple acceptance of his bartender persona had felt like the greatest gift he had ever received, the chance to discover who he was when stripped of all the external markers that usually defined him, the opportunity to build a connection based purely on compatibility and mutual attraction rather than strategic social maneuvering. Elena listened without interruption, her expression shifting through various emotions as she processed not just his words, but the obvious sincerity behind them. When he finished speaking, she sat quietly for several minutes, and Evan realized that his entire future happiness was balanced on whatever conclusion she was reaching about the man behind all his lies and the love that had driven them. Her response, When it came, surprised him with its thoughtfulness and complexity. She acknowledged the hurt his deception had caused, the way it had made her question not just his identity, but her own judgment about people and relationships. But she also admitted that the connection between them had felt real despite the false foundation, that the man who had made her laugh and listened to her dreams and cared about her happiness had seemed genuine even when everything else was performance. The question that remained was whether they could build something honest from the ruins of his elaborate deception, whether the love that had developed between them was strong enough to survive the transition from fantasy to reality. Elena's answer came not in words, but in actions. She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in the gesture that had become their private signal of connection and acceptance. But this time, the touch carried the weight of conscious choice rather than unconscious attraction. She was choosing him not despite his wealth, but regardless of it, not because he was ordinary, but because the extraordinary parts of his life mattered less than the ordinary moments they could share. The months that followed were a revelation in themselves, as Elena gradually experienced the reality of loving someone whose life operated on a scale she had never imagined. The private jets and charity galas, the business meetings that affected thousands of jobs, the security protocols and public scrutiny that came with dating one of the country's most recognizable entrepreneurs. But through all the surreal experiences of billionaire lifestyle, Elena discovered that Evan remained fundamentally the man she had fallen in love with at the Rusty Anchor. Someone who made her laugh, who listened to her thoughts with genuine interest, who remembered details about her work and her dreams with the kind of focused attention that made her feel cherished rather than merely accommodated. The proposal came a year later, not at some exotic destination or exclusive resort, but back at the Rusty Anchor where their love story had begun. Evan had arranged to have the bar to themselves for the evening, recreating as closely as possible the atmosphere of their first meeting, complete with his hilariously amateur attempt to mix her favorite drink. When he knelt beside the same bar stool where she had first made him forget he was a billionaire, when he offered her a ring that cost more than most people's houses but meant less to him than the simple word yes he was desperately hoping to hear, Elena felt her heart expand with happiness so complete it seemed to fill every empty space in her chest. Her acceptance was immediate and joyful, accompanied by tears and laughter that carried all the love she felt for the man who had been willing to risk everything: his fortune, his reputation, his carefully constructed public image, for the chance to love her openly and honestly. The wedding 6 months later was the kind of fairy tale event that appeared on magazine covers and inspired Pinterest boards. But for Elena, the most meaningful moment was during their first dance when Evan whispered against her ear that she was worth more than his entire empire, that loving her had taught him the difference between having everything and having what mattered. As they swayed together in the ballroom of his Manhattan penthouse, surrounded by flowers that cost more than most people's annual salaries and guests whose combined wealth could have funded small countries, Elena looked up at her new husband and saw not the billionaire CEO, but the man who had once nervously fumbled with cocktail shakers just to hear her laugh. In his arms, surrounded by luxury beyond anything she had ever imagined, she understood that their love story had never been about money or status or the dramatic contrast between their supposed different worlds. It had always been about two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of themselves, who had discovered that real love was worth any risk, any revelation, any transformation required to protect it. The girl who had wanted an ordinary love story had gotten something extraordinary instead, not because of the wealth or glamour that now surrounded her life, but because she had found someone who loved her with the kind of complete devotion that made every day feel like a celebration, and every shared moment feel like a gift that neither of them would ever take for granted. He had conquered the world, but his greatest triumph was winning the heart of the woman who made forever feel like home.